good nutritional integrity and food quality is an outcome of good ecology. It's an ecological outcome in and of itself. And so that tells you the critical role of nature just within that particular element. But yeah, beyond that, I mean, we evolved spending 100% of our time in natural ecosystems, and now we spend about 90% of our time indoors. That in and of itself is going to have a huge impact on microbiomes, our own ecosystems, circadian rhythms, all of that sort of stuff. So I think that's not to say that we should all just go back and be hunter-gatherers, and that's not a solution either, right? So it's about, again, for me, meeting people where they're at. And if you haven't prioritized some time in nature and contact with nature, how do we make that happen? Because even microdoses can be really, really beneficial.
This podcast is brought to you by GroundShift. If you're anything like me, you've probably realised that doing things the way they've always been done doesn't always lead to better outcomes on farm. And that's where GroundShift comes in. GroundShift is all about helping farmers rethink the way that they approach their soils, the inputs into their system, and improving their overall farm system performance. We focus on building resilience, improving efficiency, and ultimately creating more profitable farm systems. It's not always about throwing more into your system. Sometimes it's about understanding what's driving those results beneath the surface. So if you're serious about improving your farm's profitability and resilience, and utilising biology to drive your farm system performance, I highly recommend checking out groundshift.ag, and you can follow them online at groundshift.ag on Instagram. Welcome back to another episode of From the Soil Up podcast. Today's special guest is Stacey Curcio from Cultivating Wellness in Australia. I'm really excited to have Stacey on today. I was introduced to her on my Create program and have actually had the pleasure of working with her myself over the past 12 months. So I'm really excited to bring her wealth of knowledge to today's podcast and talk about the connection between food and the way it's grown, and just about our general wellness as human beings. So without further ado, let's get into it. Hey, Stacey, how are you today?
I'm really good. Thank you so much for having me on. It's so nice to be here.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure to have you on. I've actually wanted to record this podcast for probably over 12 months, so I'm stoked to have you on finally. So, Stacey, you sit at the intersection of agriculture, nutrition, and human health. When did you first realise that health of people and the health of our land is inseparable?
I think I sort of probably innately and intuitively knew that that was the case, from childhood. But I grew up surrounded by learning about, I suppose, the principles of regenerative agriculture. But of course, in the 80s and 90s, it didn't have that name. But I grew up, I suppose, having the great opportunity of visiting different landscapes and different farms, and could see that there was a different way of doing things on the landscapes, but that was really beneficial for the entire community and the family that was on that landscape and on that farm. But it probably wasn't until I formally started studying naturopathy, nutrition, holistic health, which was about 20 years ago. I sort of started that formal study. And I think that's probably where the penny really dropped in terms of the interconnectedness in language and outcomes, and the health of one is so deeply intertwined with the health of another in terms of landscapes and human health. And so I think that sort of, clinical practice probably and knowledge probably just reinforced what, I was exposed to as a kid. Yeah.
That's cool. How do we go about breaking down what seems to be silos between, I guess, nutrition and food systems and agriculture? They seem to be thought about quite separately.
And it's wild to me that that's the case, actually. And I suppose I get the fortunate position of often sitting in both camps. And so, I'm biased, I suppose, in my perspective on how important it is for the silos to be broken down. But it is really interesting when, I remember once I went to a nutrition conference. It was probably 10 or 15 years ago. And they were talking about the microbiome and epigenetics and systems and ecology and nutrient cycling. And then a month later, I went to a really good farming conference, and they were talking about microbiomes and nutrient cycling and epigenetics and similar stuff. And I was like, why aren't we all in the same room? Why are we having these conversations in these different silos? And I think there's a lot of reasons for why that's happened. But I think one of the ways in which we break that down is actually through sharing stories and storytelling, especially in health and food. Like, the story of food is changing really rapidly. So Dan Saladino, who has written a book called Eating to Extinction, I don't know if you've read it, but it's a great read. And he wrote this book called Eating to Extinction. And in that, he said that the human diet has undergone more change in the last 150 years than it has in the previous 1 million years. And so when I say the story of food is changing for people, it is changing because of that rapid change. And I think we need to acknowledge that too for our own selves. Sometimes if you feel like, wow, I don't know where to go next with my own health or nutrition, it's because there's so much happening, in that space. But what we don't want to happen is for the people who are telling the story of food to have no connection to food itself. And so when we have the story of food coming from multinational companies or people that actually have no connection with the land itself and the food production itself, that's a huge problem. And that is further siloing, health and nutrition and agriculture. And so I am just so in support of producers actually sharing about what it is they're doing, the challenges, the outcomes, like how they're going about it, and doing that really, really honestly and openly, because I think that's how we change the story of food to make it a really real and authentic one as well moving forward. And I think that's how we break down silos as well, so that there's many people telling stories, not just a couple, that get to shape that narrative, right? Like, you want as many people in that conversation. You want diversity in there as much as you possibly can. But I also think in terms of how, to that, your question, how do we sort of break down those silos as well as storytelling? I actually think this is where research can be really helpful too. I think research can really help to break down some of these silos too. And certainly for me, this is, when I get to present on, nutrition quality and farming practices, this is breaking down the silos. Like, it's showing that this study showed this, and this is for the outcome on soil health and food quality, and this comes back to human health by that way. That's the one conversation. They're not two separate conversations. So I think it's helping people recognize that it's one great big continuum. And it always has been a continuum. And we just need to remember that it is a continuum. And we've all got a role to play, I think, in terms of bringing those things back together and remembering that it is a continuum. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the really important thing, is that we are all just somewhere on that continuum.
Yeah.
And that there's so much fascinating research now linking farming practices and the nutritional quality, whether it be what the Bionutrient Food Association's doing or what Pablo Gregorini's doing here just down the road for me. All this stuff is fascinating, and I think it will start shaping the way in which we farm going forward, which is quite an exciting time to be a part of. But before we get into this a bit deeper, can you give us a bit of an introduction about who you are and a bit about your background?
Sure. So I am a qualified naturopath and clinical nutritionist, and I have just started studying a PhD as well. So I'm a student again, which is pretty exciting. And so I have a business called Cultivating Wellness, and I consult with people sometimes internationally, but often, within Australia. And so it's mostly those who live rurally and remotely, in terms of just helping them with any sort of health challenge that they may be facing. So I'm very lucky actually to get to do what I do. But aside from that, I'm also a mum. I'm a foodie. I love lots of different things. And so, I think I just feel very grateful in my life, I suppose, to get to do career-wise what gives me a lot of purpose and joy, but also I have a really supportive and loving family that, I feel really grateful for too.
That's awesome. Have you got any ideas of what your PhD is going to be really focused on?
I'm still refining that, actually. So, but what it is really, the perspective that I'm hope to come from and I'm currently coming from, is that farming practices influence more than just food quality, and therefore have a human health outcome, because of that. So we know that things like the quality of air and water and biodiversity, and perhaps even climate stability outcomes, and cultural connection, these are all what we would maybe define as like environmental drivers of health or ecological drivers of health. And so it's really looking at farming from a sort of macro lens in terms of how could farming practices that are beneficial be more well suited to the public health conversation, and what are the barriers, you know, to having these conversations about farming practices and the beneficial outcomes that can come from this in those public health circles, because there is a larger body of research that talks about the detrimental impacts of industrial agricultural practices and all of those things that I just mentioned. But of course, as you know, what has been the biggest, say, threat to biodiversity could also be our biggest opportunity in terms of those practices. And so it's really shining a light on the opportunity and how that could be, you know, where the conversations within the public health arena are lacking and how we help people get there. Yeah.
Well, that sounds like very important research. It's something I'm looking forward to reading when you do get to finishing that. I know you're only at the start now, so no pressure. I can't wait to actually read that. I think it's actually going to be really important and hopefully bring in a lot of these pieces of the puzzle together and maybe breaking down some of these silos that we talked about earlier.
It's a big driver of mine. So, you know how I was saying I was in that conference that time, and similar conversations but totally different conferences. That's something that I'm really passionate about trying to break down. And and I think there's enormous public health opportunities and beneficial outcomes that could come from not just what farmers produce but how they produce it. And so it's really digging into the how as well as the what. Yeah,
awesome. I'm looking forward to it. So your parents were one of the original people behind RCS, which is Resource Consulting Services in Australia, which is a pretty legendary business, been around for a long time now. How did you grow up with that environment, and did that kind of shape a little bit of your move towards health and the human body?
Yeah, although of course as a kid you don't know it at the time, like the big impact that, you know, a family business and your family's philosophy and principles can actually have on you, your worldview. For sure, like I was shaped pretty profoundly by that, but it probably wasn't until I was like really into study, or perhaps even towards the end of that first qualification around naturopathy, that I really realised that, okay, principally there's one mirrors the other. So, you know, we quite literally, as I said, grew up visiting farms. We grew up sitting in the back of courses that Dad was teaching and, you know, doing our best to help, but probably, you know, maybe being a little more, of a hindrance at times. But, you know, also we learnt a lot about, I suppose, the principles behind a lot of the sort of regenerative outcomes that you know he was teaching. So, you know, I was hearing from a young age about the importance of rest, for example, and in the context of landscapes. But it makes complete sense that when I was learning about that in the context of human health, it resonated, right? Like it landed with me. So definitely I think the principles had a really deep impact on me, and that's actually why I chose to go into naturopathy in the first place. It's because the principles of first do no harm, and education being important, and understanding that all things are connected, and it's not just about symptom treatment but digging into root causes. Like all of that terminology was stuff that I was somewhat familiar with and just made sense as well. Yeah, so from that perspective it was, definitely had a pretty big impact. Yeah, you can see, as you say, that the parallels between like the landscapes we work with and the human body, how those just factor into all of it. It's awesome. So your practice is basically or specifically focused around the rural communities and regional Australians. Are there health patterns that you're noticing within these communities that are quite apparent? Yeah, I think obviously, you know, the prevalence of chronic diseases are rising everywhere, but it is more noticeable for me. You know, I've done a little bit of work in urban populations, and it is more noticeable to me in rural and remote, and that's what the data reflects as well. And I think there's a whole bunch of reasons for that, and it's a really complex and challenging thing. But one of the things that is frustrating to me is sometimes when people need support and care and they live regionally or rurally or in a sort of farming community that's more isolated, it's not just about, you know, diagnosing a condition or, you know, getting the patient to realise that they need support. It's actually having that support ready to rock and roll, ready to go at a time when they need it. So it's the whole timely thing that is obvious to me sometimes in these communities and people that I work with, that the lag time and the wait time to get things looked at that they know aren't right and they've been diagnosed with, a condition, but actually getting the support they need at the time they need it, that's a problem. And that's not obviously the case across the board, but it's something that I see. But then the flip side as well, in terms of just in, the individual context, I think one of the awesome things about a lot of the people that I work with is that they understand, the importance of the landscape, and they love the landscapes. They're there for a reason, and they're often really creative, and they're often, really in touch with the source of food. So hardly anyone I speak to, doesn't have chooks. Like pretty much everybody has their own chooks, for example. And so they already understand, this sort of, and have at least one level of connection to their food because they have to. It's really important. And that's come down, intergenerationally. And so there's definitely upsides to it as well. Like it's not all, not all downsides. There's definitely upsides. But but I think there's a lot more support needed.
Mm. Yeah, it's definitely, I think, very much the same here in New Zealand with our rural communities. It feels like the support is getting less and less, and it is a struggle to even get doctors into those areas, like resourcing-wise. But funny enough, we're seeing actually a lot of American doctors coming over in here and living rurally to fill those gaps, and they're just loving it. So it's been an interesting solve there. But yeah, like you say, it's people who are on the land seem to be more connected with how their food is grown, and I think that is just generationally handed down. It's something I now miss living in town, although I do grow a lot of my own food and source a lot of my own meat and milk. But it's something that I think it becomes ingrained into you. It's like that's just the way that where food comes from, and it tastes better when you grow it yourself.
Yeah. And all of that still persists, with a lot of people that I talk to, which is just awesome. Yeah, and we want to, save that and foster that and grow upon that and, all of that as much as possible. Yeah.
So nutrition starts in the soil. How much does food quality actually depend on our soil's health and function?
Well, quite a lot. So I think if you break down in terms of, nutrition, there's almost 4 categories within nutrition. And when we're talking about food quality, so you've got the micronutrients as one subcategory, which is your vitamins and minerals. And we know, for example, that I think it was a 2014-ish meta-analysis that came out that showed that because of the reduction in mycorrhizal fungi in soil, there was about a 30% reduction in zinc levels in the crops that they were looking at. And zinc is almost on par, and depending on who you read, on par with being one of our greatest global nutrient deficiencies. Zinc is absolutely critical. And so, that's one example of soil impacting one micronutrient. So that's all the vitamins and minerals. And then you've got the next category, which is around the macronutrients, but specifically probably within that fatty acid bracket. So a lot of people are across that, ideally we want to sort of 1:1 or close to that ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 for healthy inflammatory responses in the body. And we sort of want that reflected in food as well. And obviously we are what we eats. And so whatever that animal is eating, particularly through dairy and meat, obviously influences the fatty acid profile of that food. And that can have massive health consequences, beneficial ones as well, or not so good ones, depending on what perspective you're coming from. So that's an impact. That's I suppose an example, of how, what that animal's eating, depending on, the plant health and therefore the soil health impacts the fatty acid profile and therefore us. So that's sort of the second category. And then you've got the microbial metabolites, or the microbiome. And of course, we know that carries through from soil, plant, animal to us as well. And there's awesome stuff coming out about linking health of soil to the health of our own microbiome, and not just soil microbes, but, microbes in the air, microbes in water, all of those microbes in the environment and how they're impacting and influencing us from a human health perspective as well. So that's sort of another way in which food, your soil health impacts human health, and food quality is one way. Food is one way by which it gets there. And then the final sort of subcategory is around the secondary metabolites, or the phytochemicals. Used to be really just called antioxidants, but we now know that they're more than antioxidants. And so farming practices can have a huge impact, massive impact on the phytochemical profile in terms of not just the phytochemical density of that food, but also the actual types in there as well, because, you know, you want healthy ratios of healthy types of phytochemicals. And so that definitely comes back, you know, to a large extent to the biology and the health of that soil. And I know John Kempf a couple of times has said, you know, if we are going to have a legitimate conversation about food as medicine, this is where the medicine starts. And he's referring to those secondary metabolites and those phytochemicals. And it used to be thought that those phytochemicals, as I said, were just antioxidants. So they're just scavenging free radicals, like, for example, the blue in the blueberries, or what puts the orange in the turmeric. And that's antioxidants, that's scavenging free radicals. And that's basically reducing this thing called oxidative stress. And oxidative stress is something that's referred to a lot in human health in regards to being a driver or promoter of chronic disease. Just like we hear chronic inflammation can be a bit of a fertilizer for chronic disease, so too can oxidative stress. So we need bucket loads of antioxidants. And so they still do that. You know, these phytochemicals can absolutely do that. But we also know that these phytochemicals in plants do lots of other things for us. So, for example, they can help us detoxify. So there's certain phytochemicals in certain plants that are brilliant for detoxification pathways in the body. We've got some plants that modulate hormones. So there's a whole sort of category of phytochemicals that are known as like phytoestrogens, and they can modulate hormones in the body. So they can impact us through this other pathway. We also know that they can sort of turn on and turn off our genes. So they work epigenetically as well. They can regulate our temperature. You know, like if you've had chili, right? Like you're not getting heat from the chili in your body and feeling that heat because of the vitamins and minerals in that food. You're getting that because of the phytochemicals in that food, and that impacts your body temperature. And we've got cooling foods and we've got heating foods. And so they're doing that as well. And we know that a lot of these phytochemicals are now being seen as prebiotics. So basically, they're feeding our beneficial microbes as well. And so they're doing a lot in the body. And essentially, when you sort of zoom out from all of that, they're essentially modulators and they're catalysts for balance in the body. And in my view, the holy grail of health from one sort of perspective anyway is balance. It's what we call homeostasis. Like it is balance. It's not too much of one nutrient at the cost of another, right? Like it's all about balance. It's not having no inflammations, but it's not being chronically inflamed either. It's about balance. And this is what these phytochemicals do. And we know, like there was a study looking into like it was organic versus conventional. And obviously there's a whole conversation around, you know, organic and soil health. But essentially what it showed was that due to better practices, farming practices, there was a 20 to 60% increase in the phytochemical profile of those foods grown in a better way. And so when you think about the potential impacts on human health of that, you know, the fact that these phytochemicals work in all of these different ways, and that's just what we know. Like there's probably heaps that we still don't know. So we're still learning so much about actually, to be honest, what's in food. You know, like it is so much more complex than I think what we've appreciated, particularly in nutrition science. I mean, it's hugely complex. And so that's what excites me a bit about the research coming out actually is it's trying to, and it is looking into that complexity of food. Yeah, all of those phytochemicals, the microbial metabolites, like it's not just looking at the zinc or the fatty acids, you know, and I think that's the direction we need to go in so we can appreciate that complexity. And might I say too, Conan, that once we appreciate that complexity, then we understand that we cannot replace what we're still learning about in terms of the complexity and what is so complex because nature has provided that beautiful complexity to us. We can't replace that with an ultra-processed food easily at all. You know, we just look at the complexity of milk, right, or dairy. Very difficult to replace that, you know, with a product that we would say, oh, nutritionally this is similar, but it's dairy-free. Like, well, actually, but when you look at the complexity of food, that's just, yeah, I would argue impossible to do.
That was some of the most fascinating things I've heard on this podcast. Like, this is just a real passionate area for me, and I don't really know where to start. But it's probably that last piece actually is around, we're seeing a lot of these alternatives to, I guess, our whole foods, and they're being, marketed as nutritionally the same and just as healthy, if not healthier. But if we bring it down to kind of that secondary metabolite level, that's not quite the story.
That's absolutely right. And there's been research that's been done on this with meat, right? So you've got, grass-fed beef versus like an Impossible Burger sort of situation. So, entirely lab produced versus entirely natural. And when you look at some of those macros, you can match that. They can match that in a lab in terms of, say, fatty acids and profiles and amino acids and things. When you look at some of the vitamins and minerals that we might look for in red meat that, it's known for, so zinc, B12, iron, for example, that to an extent can be matched. However, when you look at the actual phytochemical density in that and profile of the ground beef, grass-fed, I think it was, and compare that to the Impossible Burger, there was a massive difference nutritionally in those two things, like massive. And so we're missing such a big part of the nutritional picture. And that's frustrating because people are they're not being misled because, I don't know, it's hard to get the terminology right, but I think we're not capturing that full picture. And that is, that's a problem. And so, we've got to be careful when whole foods are demonized and then all of a sudden there's an alternative that pops up on the market, that is entirely lab produced. To be honest, it never really ends well for the planet or for us. And so we've got to be very mindful, not to repeat history in that way. And I love that some research is coming out to show that, that there's a lot more to food than perhaps what we've previously acknowledged.
Yeah, I think we intuitively kind of know that, but it's great to see that the research is backing these things up. I just want to clarify a couple of small things that you're talking about before. Can you just explain what a free radical is, just for my brain?
Yeah. So basically a free radical is like we're producing them at all different times, but it's something that the body produces generally in response to some sort of biochemical pathway. And so what it sort of does is it almost accelerates the aging process, and it's unstable for the body. And so then what we actually need is a different charge in terms of our antioxidants to sort of quench that free radical to restore that sort of homeostasis. Yeah.
Cool. No, that's good. I just wanted to clarify that because I've heard the term multiple times and I'm like, I think I understand it, but I just wanted to clarify that. And then around the importance of that omega-6 to 3 ratio. So we're looking for a 1-to-1 is the goal roundabout? Generally,
yeah. It's not, you're not always going to get it bang on, but you want it in the ballpark of that, if possible. Whereas, obviously, as you would know, a lot of the data is showing that, it's more like 15-to-1, 20-to-1 in our food, in some of those foods that would traditionally maybe be 1-in-1 if they were, more natural farming methods versus, your conventional or industrial. Yeah.
Oh, cool. I think the really interesting thing here is the parallels between like the complexity of soil and the complexity of like our health and nutrition as well. Like there's actually just so much unknown about all these little interactions that actually benefit us as humans. I've heard the term that basically our gut microbiome is a kind of direct reflection of the soil microbiome that our food's grown in. Is that true?
I think that we can think about them as similar ecosystems, but there's obviously going to be differences, within that. But they're both ecosystems that need diversity for resilience. So that's probably for me, one of the biggest sort of similarities between soil and gut. I think too that we can think about both of them as being almost like communication hotspots. So, they're the center of so much of that communication. And in the gut, for example, that might be hormone-related communication, or it could be neuron-related communication. But it's the hub of that communication. And I think too that if both of them are disturbed, then the ramifications can be wide-ranging for that ecosystem too. So whether that's a landscape or whether that's us. So there's definitely a lot of similarities, in that regard for sure.
So basically, it's really important to have diversity within our own diet. And as we know, we really do need biodiversity in our farming systems for them to thrive, particularly for the long term. Like that's almost coming back to those principles that you grew up with, is like they are very similar in human health and actually what is good for our farming systems as well.
Yeah, that's right. And when you think about something like we just talked about, for example, the lab-grown meat versus the real meat, and a major difference there is diversity, right? Like in terms of the complexity and nutritional diversity that we're getting in one versus the other. And so that's one of the ways in which diversity is waning in our diets, and that is having, human health implications. And so diversity is super important. I think it's, I think there's a lot of fear-mongering now around a lot of whole foods even. And that's causing is a lack of trust and a lack of diversity, like a lack of trust in the food, but also a lack of diversity. And that's concerning because that destabilizes the system. And so I think for me, one of the things that if someone's really restricted in what they're eating and has pulled out a lot of whole foods, I'm really trying to unpack why and how do we build that back, meeting someone where they're at for sure, but what's happened there, what's led to that, and how do we, because that diversity really is resilience, in my view, anyway, from a human health perspective. Yeah.
So you're kind of coming at it as from the whole human. So trying to understand it's not just about the food, it's about, I guess, what are the key drivers of the stories around why they eat the way that they do.
Absolutely, yeah. And a lot of times people are really conflicted. They might read one thing one day about this and then the next thing the next day about the same, completely conflicting the very next day. And so that noise and that conflicting information, I think, for some people is like really harmful in terms of, then they just sort of zero in on, a handful of foods. And so it's about, definitely building that trust up, for them about what is it exactly that you're concerned about and how do we build back, safety. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
and trust.
Geez, sometimes I read stuff and I'm like, you can be empathetic of the way and people believe certain things because it can, the way it's presented and you understand, and it's like, oh, well, actually I can see why people believe that. So I guess that's the hard thing. There is just so much information out there at the moment. So it's very, particularly around nutrition, I feel, or maybe it's just my algorithms, based around health and nutrition and farming. So, but it's just, there's all different sorts of things. And I'm like, all of this could be true or none of this could be true. That's right. It's like, how do you wade through it?
Yeah. And the two things that are often missing is context and nuance.
Yeah, absolutely.
That is what's missing. So there's often an element of truth. It's like, there's an element there's a thread of truth, but in this context, that's not true. But in that context, it might be. Or with this little bit of nuance added, it changes the entire conversation for somebody. And context and nuance is something that is difficult to capture on social media, but especially. That's, I think for me anyway, it comes down to just finding really trusted sources, trusted people, and, with integrity and knowledge and, as few bias as possible, and understanding also the importance of context and nuance, and that there's no one size fits all.
Yeah, very much like farming. It's all about context and nuance, and what works here won't work on the farm right next door or 20 k's away, which, people get frustrated with. And it's like, well, you can't just cookie cutter everything because that leads to generally adverse outcomes.
And it can backfire when you compare to someone beside you. And this is exactly why comparisons in health anyway, in regards to I'll do what that person did, and sometimes that can go really well. But, when you compare yourself to somebody else, it's actually not helpful. You've got to compare yourself to yourself, and how you were last week or last year, or, that's where if you're going to do any comparisons, that's where you do it. Yeah,
I'm a fan of it's kind of you versus you in the world. Like you should be only comparing a bit yourself and where you want to go, and are you improving all the time? I think this leads quite nicely into this term or this topic that you like to talk about, which is around food culture. So what would a generally healthy food culture look like?
Yeah, I do. I'm fascinated by food culture. I think it's really important. Food culture basically informs how we perceive food, especially, and a lot about that trust and safety and knowledge. Like in Fred Provenz's book, for example, Nourishment, he talks about the 3 pillars of nutritional wisdom. And one of those pillars is intergenerational knowledge. And that's where food culture sits in from a human health perspective. And so when we have information around, even just, for example, cooking and food preparation techniques, that is fundamental to the outcome that we're going to experience. And so I think Michael Pollan said that food culture was around long before food science. And I always remember that. And I think it's a really important one for us to remember, who also like the science side of things as well, that it's, when our perceptions can be, so powerful in terms of our impact on our relationship with food in many ways. Where do those perceptions come from? What is the culture that they were in, and how is that informing that? And a lot of that does come down to, I think, that intergenerational knowledge. And when that pillar of nutritional wisdom is severed, you think about that in the context of animals, if they're just sort of on their own and they're trying to wade through a landscape without the support of their mob, around them, and the knowledge coming from, mum or the herd, then how are they going to go, with that? And so I think we're losing food culture and so much of that knowledge around, especially cooking, preparing, that sometimes some of our conversations around food, it's a shame that that's not spoken about more, actually, because it really informs, So prime example is someone was asking me the other day about oxalates. She'd read that oxalates were problematic. That's a class of phytochemical, and it's found in things like beetroot and green leafy vegetables and dark chocolate. And there's a couple of books written on, that they can be really damaging for human health. They can this oxalic acid can accumulate in joints and cause, gallbladder stones and all of these sorts of things. So she was avoiding these foods. But when we talked about actually how you prepare, for example, beetroot, if you preserve beetroot or cook beetroot or add a bit of calcium-rich foods to beetroot, the oxalates are reduced. And so you're going to be probably fine, with that food. But it was all of that extra conversation around the cooking and the preparing that, was lacking. And she didn't have that knowledge to actually change the game, around those foods. And the other thing too is, like, we have a bug in our gut called Oxalobacter forminges, which should break down, oxalates. And so, if the microbiome's in a really good spot, then you're going to be, really good, with those particular, that particular class of phytochemicals as well. So again, like context and nuance, but also the culture side of things. I think it's, I could probably go on and on with different examples, but I do think that it's really important. And there's a reason why Fred talks about intergenerational knowledge in his book. It's incredibly important for human health as well.
Yeah, I think it is actually a really important topic, because that knowledge has been handed down generationally, and are we handing that down to the current generation so they can carry on? I am starting to see people wanting to, preserve more of their foods and grow their own and source better quality food. But is that potentially maybe just a smaller microcosm and my brain filtering for those sort of things in the world? So it might not be as widespread as I think. But I generally feel that people are starting to become more interested in how their food is prepped, and I think it also just comes back to that thing where it actually just seems to taste so much more satisfying when you've done it all yourself too.
Yeah. But I agree. There is a lot more happening, or a lot again that I'm seeing that's just really encouraging around, cooking, and a lot of these, like a lot of old recipes have so much wisdom encoded in them. So this is this whole thing, like food culture was around before food science. So for example, often really, really old recipes with sausages will have like fennel in them. And so the herbs are there, like and spices. The fennel, for example, is there not just as a flavoring agent, but it actually helps us digest the richness of the meat. And that's food culture. Like, that's not put there by accident. There's so much of that I hope, we can hold on to and actually extend upon, for future generations, for sure.
I'll remember that next time I'm having pork and fennel sausages that I'm now cultured.
But you're thinking about like rosemary and lamb, and like there's so many, if you really think about it, you're like, oh yeah, that's right. Sage and chicken, like so many recipes, right? They have this beautiful, and there's so much wisdom in old recipes. I love old recipe books as well. I love reading through them because you learn something.
Yeah, and it is incredible. You just think it's there for the best flavour pairing, but it's actually got another layer to it.
There's a reason. Yeah.
Which
as
is
well
incredible.
as flavour. Yeah, it's all it's all important. Yeah.
It's all pluses. It's everything stacking on top of each other, which is great. So how did we I guess this term food culture is probably not something that I am overly hearing everywhere. Do you think this is something that we need to start talking about in the agricultural industry as well, to start bridging that gap between nutrition and the ag industry?
Oh, good question. Probably. Because if we think about, again, that it is such a pillar, especially of that nutritional wisdom of that animal. So when I say nutritional wisdom, I'm talking about the ability of that animal to self-select, self-medicate, nourish themselves, and that, I think that, I don't know if I'm answering your question properly, but it's sort of, I think, to answer your question shortly, yes, it's important for everyone to be considering this, but I imagine that is also happening as well. It may not be spoken about perhaps quite as much as it should be. Yeah.
Yeah. Obviously, the new trendy term is nutrient density. How does this fit into, I guess, the food culture?
Well, I think in terms of food culture, so much of it is about flavour, right? Learning about the different flavours, adjusting your palate, teaching your palate about different sorts of flavours and flavour profiles as well. And that's nutrient density, like it's so much about flavour and flavour profiles and deliciousness. And so deliciousness is really a core element, I think, of the health conversation as well. And so, yes, it ties in beautifully, with the conversation of food culture.
What is nutrient density to you, first of all? What does that actually mean?
So nutrient density, probably to me, it's just about talking about how much bang for our buck are we getting in terms of nutrition versus calories, like in terms of the actual concentration of nutrients within, the energy of that particular food. And it obviously, as I said, directly relates to flavour and those sorts of things. But one of the very cool findings that came from Dan Kittredge and the Bionutrient Food Association's work is just the enormous amount of variation and variability that there is maybe naturally within the food nutrient density conversation. But then regardless of the label that we give the farming practice, organic, homegrown, biodynamic, regenerative, conventional, etc., the thing that on all of those that contributed the most to higher nutrient density in vitamins, minerals, phytochemicals was just the health of the soil. And I think that's for me, that were just really wonderful takeaways from so many years of hard work in gathering that information, and that is something to take away, that sometimes we can get really caught up on labels, I think. And titles and names, and so it was a good reminder, that actually it's what lies underneath that.
Yeah, well, that's probably one of the things I'm starting to think about, is this term nutrient density is now becoming obviously quite widely spoken about. I guess I don't want to see a whole lot of misconceptions come around what that actually means and it repackaged. So I do like the term nutrient richness, more so talking about the variety, and I think that comes back to the diversity thing you were talking about earlier as being really key to our diet. So yeah, it's an interesting conversation. It's an evolving.
It is, and and to that point, it's totally still evolving, and so it's really nice to sort of see the evolution of that as well. For me, I suppose when I refer to the nutritional quality of food, I talk about nutritional integrity. And so it's sort of probably for similar reasons to you in terms of integrity. For me, encompasses a little more about not just the nutrients, right, and not just that nutrient profile, but all of the other things that may be on that food that maybe we don't want to be, and actually just what's the integrity of that generally. So, yeah, I think that, again, it's evolving, but it's awesome, I think, for me to see that it's spoken a lot more about. One of the things too that's worth mentioning, and something that I think about a lot, is that we're not all the same in terms of how we benefit from that. So for some people, for example, if I go and pick a carrot that's an heirloom carrot that's grown in now healthy soil, and I have that in my lunch this morning, then from soil to plate to gut body, it's a very short journey. And of course, there's going to be awesome outcomes from that. But for so many people, it can be a long road from that where that food originates to by the time it actually reaches them. And so there can be, because of that long journey, for some people, there can be a few barriers that arise along the way for people, whether that's accessibility issues, whether that is around, like, for example, we could grow, this second one sort of ties back into maybe education and food culture a little bit too, in regards to, I could grow a beautiful globe artichoke, and, that could end up on somebody's plate in somewhere else in the country. But if they don't know how to cook globe artichoke, then, it's a missed opportunity. So I think it's sort of, again, what we spoke about right at the start is that the connection between food and farming at the soil level and the human health level, it's complex, it's diverse, it's bidirectional, and there's so many ways in which we can improve that, for people on the tail end of it. And so there's lots of opportunity within that, I think, to improve upon that as well. But just want to acknowledge that it's not just about, it's not always simple, for people. And the reality, and I think what clinical practice has taught me, is that people sit on all levels of that continuum. And so how do we help them as well? Because there's solutions and support for everybody, I believe, no matter where you sit, on that continuum, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. It definitely makes sense. I do like that term, nutrient integrity. It's not just the food, it's all the processes that go into it.
Yeah.
How much does cooking certain foods impact like that nutritional integrity? Is that a factor?
Yeah, I think for some nutrients it has a negative impact, and for some it actually can have a positive impact. So, for example, if like vitamin C can be lost relatively easily, magnesium is lost relatively quickly post-harvest, for example. Magnesium does not like processing, so you lose a lot of mag when you're doing processing, for example. But then you've got, for example, lycopene, which is a phytochemical found in tomatoes. If you cook that with olive oil, this is again this food culture coming in, if you cook that, then you actually can get more of that phytochemical. If you, for example, make, from cabbage to sauerkraut, so you ferment that cabbage, you're increasing the vitamin C content in that. By doing that, you're increasing some of those secondary metabolites by doing that. So cooking can do a few different things, and processing generally, cooking part of that can do, I'm talking natural processes, can do a few things, wide and varied to food. Yeah.
It's very interesting. It's the same thing again, where it's kind of context specific, isn't it?
Yeah.
And you can read one thing that says don't do this or don't cook that, or if you have too much of this secondary metabolite, it's going to make you sick. But it's actually zooming out a bit, isn't it?
Yeah. And this is where, in my view, diversity is a buffer for that, right?
Yeah.
Diversity is important to not just give us a wider variety of microbes, a more resilient gut microbiome, but a wider variety of secondary metabolites, fatty acids, vitamins and minerals, but it also protects us from overdoing it and giving ourselves a potential toxicity of something as well. I always think about one client who was getting sort of what felt like a really sudden case of hives, and she couldn't put it down to anything. And I spoke to her about what's happened in the last couple of weeks, and she'd changed her diet dramatically. She was following a particular type of diet that she wanted to give a go, and unbeknownst to me, any of this had happened, and basically had restricted her diet so much that she was just on a rotation of about 5 foods, and basically had given herself a bit of a histamine overdose. And so it was just that there was that lack of diversity then was no longer a protective factor for overdoing something as well. So, yeah, diversity works in a few ways. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so intertwined, our health and farming. It's wild. I guess there's some other interesting evidence around the impact of, say, this is taking the whole human approach, but how nature and our nervous system can recover better. Like, so does nature play a key part in this as well? It's not just so much about what we feed ourselves, but kind of our environment at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. And for starters, even with food, like, you know, good nutritional integrity and food quality is an outcome of good ecology. Like it's an outcome, it's an ecological outcome in and of itself. And so that tells you the critical role of nature just within that particular element. But yeah, beyond that, I mean, we evolved spending 100% of our time in natural ecosystems, and now we spend about 90% of our time indoors. You know, that in and of itself is going to have a huge, you know, a massive impact on microbiomes, our own ecosystems, you know, circadian rhythms, all of that sort of stuff. So I think that's not to say that we should all just go back and be hunter-gatherers, and, you know, that's not a solution either, right? So it's about, again, for me, meeting people where they're at. And if you haven't prioritized some time in nature and contact with nature, how do we make that happen? Because even microdoses can be really, really beneficial. It's like with exercise, microdoses can be really, really beneficial. And so it's all about fitting it in, you know, and meeting people where they're at. But it's powerful medicine. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely notice it when I'm out on farm rather than in my office, how much clearer my head is and how much more creativity that automatically comes into my brain, and how much better I feel as well, to be honest. But it is. It's just I wish I did more of it, and I am working that way. But inherently, you have to do some inside work.
Yeah.
But I think it is a really key part of making us as humans perform at our best as well, as having that nature as a key fundamental part of our functional well-being.
That's right. And again, it's not via one pathway, right? Like, I don't think we can pin it down to just one thing. It's all of it. Like, we're sensory. It affects all of our senses, nature, the smells, the sounds. And when I've spoken to different producers, particularly those that are regenerative, and I'll say, you know, what do you love the most about what you do? And it's things like smelling the soil, hearing the birds. It's all sensory, natural, you know, the impact of nature on those senses. It can't be underestimated ever, I don't think.
Yeah. So for those listening, what would be some foundational habits that can actually dramatically improve their well-being, do you think?
Good question. I think, firstly, consistency with anything, I think, is at the heart of long-term results. So, for example, I could answer that and say, well, you know, at least an hour in nature, at least an hour of exercise, at least 8 hours of sleep. But if someone's not going to be able to be consistent with that, then how helpful is that? If they can nail that for 2 weeks and then not at all. So it's about, you know, understanding, firstly, lifestyle medicine. You know, this is this whole umbrella of, you know, food, sleep, environment, stress management. And so often what I'll do is say, I'll ask someone, you know, within that, and sunshine being another one, within that, which part do you think maybe you're giving like the lion's share of energy and attention to, and which part is maybe a little neglected, if any at all, and where can we restore a little bit of balance within some of those core, you know, some of those core pillars. So for some people, they'll say it's hands down sleep. That's where I need to work on. You know, for some people it'll be exercise, and for some people it'll be stress, and for some people it'll be food. But I think they're all just as strong as each other, but just in different ways. And but the key is then, if you are going to work on something, think, okay, I'm going to work on my sleep, or I'm going to work on my exercise, because you get so much return on investment for those things, I think. Then how consistent are you going to be with that, you know, over the long term? And you might not be, you know, it's going to change over time, obviously, but it's also, I think, about making those things into habits rather than just something that's a passing fad and a passing trend. It's about building habits, and often people build habits, you know, one tiny bite at a time. Yeah. So as much as I'd love to say we could, you know, do all of these big things, I think the reality and what my clients have taught me is that that's not always practical, and that's not always how we work best as humans either. And I want someone to get long-term benefit, you know, from what they're doing. Yeah. But again, acknowledging that sometimes just 5 minutes, a 5-minute walk or a 5 minutes in the sun or 5 minutes of, maybe not 5 minutes of sleep, but maybe a little bit more than that, or maybe 5 minutes of sleep if it's a little nap, can be hugely restorative too.
Yeah.
And not underestimating the micro habits either.
Yeah, I think those micro habits stack up over time, and it's surprising. Like, it's easier to build a small habit than integrate a new big one, especially if you don't have the time or the space for it. You can't.
Exactly. And what we need to do in those moments too is give ourselves like a massive high five and pat on the back for maybe the micro thing that we've done, for that little walk that we integrated this week that we didn't do last week, for, putting down our phones and going to bed an hour earlier. Rather than sometimes we can be so self-critical, and say, well, I should have done it every day. That's not how we actually wire neurons. That's not how we form habits. If you're negative about the progress you're making, it's going to take longer to make the progress. And so it's really important for us to sort of like celebrate the small wins, because that's how we rewire faster, and that's how we embed new habits faster. So I'm all about celebrating the small wins. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fantastic advice, I think. Not enough people do that.
No.
So we've talked a lot about, I guess, nutrition and agriculture and how they are siloed. Well, whose responsibility is it to try and reconnect both of those?
I don't think it's one person's, I think you knew I was going to say that, one person's responsibility at all. I think that would be really unfair to put that on one person or even one sector. Yeah, I think it's sort of everyone's role to within their own sphere of influence, because we've all got our own little sphere of influence, right? How can we just move the needle? And I'm a really big fan of education within that, but non-judgmental, solid information, I think that again is trust, and then you're building trust between all the different people in all the different parts of the continuum, rather than us all disagreeing or, having our own issues within it. It's really just about looking at the bigger picture. And I think also maybe I'm an optimist, but I think that it can happen pretty quickly if we collectively decide that it's going to happen quickly. Like, I really think it can. It's sort of got to be a conscious thing that everyone's working towards.
Yeah, I believe so too. I mean, when we're all working towards one thing, it's amazing how fast it can shift. And if you've got more than one industry or sector working towards the same outcome, I believe that would be a very powerful shift for those communities that would benefit from it.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. So I finish up all my podcasts with one quick fire question, which is, what's one belief or principle that keeps you grounded no matter what season you're in?
Oh, can I have two? You
can have two, yeah.
The first one is trust the process.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. I come back to that one often, just trust the process. And the second one is trust your gut. It knows what your head hasn't figured out yet.
Beautiful.
So I'm, definitely getting better at listening to my gut and intuition as I get older, and grateful for that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's something that I've actually been actively trying to work on this year, and try not to override with my own brain going, was that my brain or was that my gut?
How are you going with it? Yeah.
I would say normally not great, but I feel like the last month or so, there's been a few situations where my gut has probably overridden my brain to react to certain things, and just been like, check the other person's emotion and move forward and through, and that's not a reflection on me. So maybe it's working. I think when I'm trying to do it, it doesn't work, which I guess is not trusting your gut. So
that's the head going.
Yeah.
No, but that's progress, because I believe it's like a muscle we've got to strengthen, right? I really do. And it's going to be a bit wobbly at the start. It is for me, but it's interesting too. Those two things that I mentioned are probably interconnected, right? Trust the process, trust the gut. That's in any season. They're my rocks. Yeah.
Yeah. And they're super powerful. And like, I find that in the past, I've just come back to the gut feel that I originally had anyway, after I've done all the thinking. So I wasted time and energy. But thank you very much for your time today, Stacey. I've really enjoyed this podcast. It's I've learnt a lot. There's a couple of books you've mentioned that I'm going to have to go away and read, or finish reading. So thank you very much for your time today. It's been awesome.
Oh, you're so welcome. Thank you so much for having me. Keep up all the good work.
Absolutely. And where's the best place that the listeners can connect with you and learn about what you do?
Probably just my website. So it's just www.cultivatingwellness.com.au, and probably the place that I maybe share the most in terms of interesting stuff or stuff that I think is sort of helpful or relevant is my newsletter. So I send out a little newsletter every fortnight, and that anything cool that comes across, my desk or computer or brain, I think, okay, hopefully that's going to be helpful, to someone too.
Yeah, they're great. Always read them. Thank you very much, Stacey. I really appreciate it.
No worries. Thanks, Conan.